Your fangs do look amazing.
Thank you. I'm going to keep them in for a week.
You should. You should. Should have them put in permanently. It looks real good.
It's super glue.
Garrett, you should probably start. We have 59 people on. So.
Excellent. Everybody is coming in. Well, good evening, everybody. These fangs are not going to last. My name is Gareth Evans. I'm the director at the Bellamy Museum. I'm wearing fangs. We are vampires tonight. We're really pleased to see you all here for this event online. Obviously, we're fairly, I can't do it, Halloween themed. How do vampires do it? We'll find out in a minute. We're really pleased to have Dr. Michaela Howells on this evening to talk about vampire science, the folklore behind it, the real anthropology that's studied through vampires. You might know the Bellamy Museum in downtown Wilmington is owned by Preservation North Carolina. We do a lot of online stuff, a lot of it educational in all these kinds of funky ways, like the way we're doing it tonight in a Halloween theme. We are recording this. This is also being live streamed to Bellamy's Facebook account. Towards the end, Carolyn Gonzalez, who's one of our staff members at the museum, is going to moderate, and I'll chime in, I'm sure, with some questions and answers from Michaela as we go along. So you should all be muted. If you'll silence the dogs and all the things in the background, wolves, as we said, we'll get on. Dr. Michaela Howells is a UNCW anthropologist, assistant professor there. She's a human biologist, and her work focuses on this kind of thing, the intersection of people and culture. She's got a PhD in Colorado in anthropology around things like medicine, health, and education. Last year, for one of these, I can't believe it's been a year, but we talked about the sort of macabre Victorian mourning practices, which was fantastic. I know this one's going to be too. And this, when we record it, we'll post it on our website, our YouTube channel. Also, Preservation North Carolina carries them. And all the other shelter series things that PNC does on preservation and history as well. So I'll stop talking and let Dr. Michaela Howells share her screen, and off we go.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that, for the invitation to speak with you all today. And thank you all of you at home or wherever you may be from your coffin for tuning in and spending your evening with me. Give me one moment to share my screen and we'll be off to the races. Okay, one moment here. And could you give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen without the notes on the side?
You look good.
All right, excellent, excellent. So who doesn't love vampires, right? I was just speaking to a reporter earlier in the week, and I pointed out that I feel like almost all girls, women, people in general may go through, they kind of go through like a horse stage, they go through a dolphin stage, and then they go through a vampire stage. And I mean, there's a lot of reasons behind that drawer, but we also know that it's an important fold into our folklore and our understanding of ourselves. And so through today's talk, I'm going to, whoa, I'm moving forward fast there. Moving through today's talk, I'm going to be talking about vampires from a cultural and historical and a biological framework. And I know that there are so many different vampires out there, and there's so many favorite vampires out there. And if I did not include your favorite vampire in here, I am sorry. Throw it in the chat. I'd love to know who your favorite vampire is to add it to future talks. And with these characters, these beings will not be showing up in today's talk. But everything of the essence that came into building them up as beings and as these entities within our cultural mindscape, we will be talking about today. So we're going to be talking about vampires from an anthropological, historical, epidemiological, so it's disease, economic and forensic framework today. And I'll be touching on some of these themes to sort of see how all of these cross over, and how this ties in as being a question that's strong for the Bellamy Mansion. Now, I want to share a little bit about what anthropology is before we get going, and the framework that I am working in. So as Gareth pointed out, I am an anthropologist, and anthropologists use a comparative studies of humans cross-culturally. So we're interested in humans from all different perspectives, but we're interested in understanding those perspectives, especially from a global perspective, right? I'm a biological anthropologist, and my work focuses on this intersection of biology and culture, which is if you've ever heard of human biology, that's what I do. Medical anthropology, those are some of the ways in I ask questions. And I'm really interested in differences in health, and with this working closely with the local community. Now, the work I'm going to talk to you about today and the topic I'm going to explore with you today, this is not my normal everyday research. This is not my normal career path, right? This is something that I'm using the framework of my expertise to explore and engage with. And so I hope you'll ask lots of questions, and I hope even more that I can answer some of those questions for you. So as you're thinking of questions, feel free to throw them in the chat, and we're going to have some time for questions towards the end. Okay, so let's start off by taking a cross-cultural perspective on vampires. So vampires, if we ask people how they perceive vampires, what vampires are and who they are, frequently, contemporarily, people talk about them as these really masculine individuals in one way or another, like they are more likely or not than not to be male. They take on a male form, a masculinized form. But what we see if we take a historical and a cross-cultural approach, that vampires, broadly understood, have much more frequently been a feminine or female form throughout time. And there's themes associated with this, this use of females as a core component of the vampire story. Now, vampires, we look at demons, got my demon horns. When we look at demons and we look at vampires, we're looking at individuals who are sucking the energy, the life essence away from others. And as I'm pulling on these cross-cultural representations, they may not be like named vampires by those cultures, but they are individuals who are sucking the life out of. So it's a very, very short list that I'll be talking about in a minute here. But what we see, especially early on in the record, is that cross-culturally, we see this relationship between vampires and sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS. We see a relationship with fetal demise and infant and child death, right? And so we see this pattern over and over throughout history and throughout cultures. I'm going to give you a couple of examples in just a moment here. And we also see, in addition to it being these female or feminized individuals who are considered vampires, we also see this tying into stories of subservience to men or lack of subservience to men. So I want to pause for a moment, and I apologize. I meant to share this with you earlier, and I apologize that we've come this far. If you have any sensitivities, or I would like you to be aware that if you have any sensitivities to some of these topics, I would want to be aware that these are coming up. So obviously we've already talked about miscarriage. We're going to be talking about cannibalism, sexism, modification of corpses, and death, and discussion of death and dying processes and death processes. So just be aware, all are welcome, all ages are welcome, but to be aware that's what is coming your way. Coming back to these themes that we see over and over of a pregnancy disruption, we can look across. So I have a couple. We have Lilith showing up in ancient Jewish texts. We see Lamastu in Mesopotamia, Lamia in Greece, and Rangda in Bali. Now, I'd love to go through and talk about each one of these examples, but I would like to focus here on Rangda. So here's Rangda. Rangda is this Demon, she is, I need both hands to describe her to you. Rangda is, if you've ever been to Bali, Indonesia, right? If you've ever been to any of the performances that are done within the arts communities, right? You've likely seen Rangda dance. So this is a very contemporary embodiment of a demon, the spirit, a witch, right? She takes all of these forms. And so Rangda, in the form that you have, if you look at the form on the left, you'll notice that she has these long pendulous breasts. Let me see if I can point, like these long pendulous breasts. You can see here as well, right? She tends to be heavy, heavier than certainly the average Indonesian woman, right? And you can see these grotesque face features of her face. She's got these long fangs. She has a tongue of fire. Who doesn't want a tongue of fire? Am I right? Am I right? Anyways, tongue of fire, flames from her hair, right? And she is just this epitome of problematic woman, right? So what's her story? So she is a demon, a vampire, if you will, who, if you do not pay attention, if you do not put out offerings, Balinese make tens of hundreds of offerings a day to put out to different spirits, demons, gods, demigods, right? And recognizing their presence. Well, Rangda, if you are not putting out their offering, especially when you're pregnant or you have someone in your household who is pregnant, she's going to come and she is going to disrupt your pregnancy. She is going to potentially kill your children, right? In terms of like SIDS, so taking away their soul in the night. And she's also known for eating the dead. So clearly this is someone who you want to steer clear of, and put out, anything that can help protect you from her and her influence. So I've worked in Bali now for about 20 years, and I do research there. And I've always been, magnetized to Rangda, because who doesn't love a strong, powerful woman with a tongue of flame? And you start asking questions about, well, who is she? How did she become? Rangda became Rangda. So Rangda is actually a translation from Javanese. It translates to widow, and widow is what she is. So her story is that she was a powerful woman. She had a lot of money, a land, right? But in Bali, land is passed down through the men. So if your husband dies, your land is passed on to his brother or your son, but you aren't in control of it. Well, the story goes that Rangda's husband died, and her brother-in-law tried to move in with his whole family. Like, you can still stay in that house, but you can stay in sort of like the side room. You get kicked out of your room, you get to just be there as effectively a guest in your own house. Well, the story goes that Rangda refused to leave. And she was just like, nope, that's not going to happen. So she's not following through with what's expected of her through the patriarchy, right? And as she stayed there, more women started coming to her, other widow women, other women who left their husbands, and started coming and living with her. And so, as you can probably hear, anytime that you get a series of women who aren't following the rules in one place, you immediately have like a coven of witches, right? Because it's like, well, these women are outside of what's supposed to be happening, outside of the social norms. So over time, Rangda becomes more and more grotesque, more and more deformed, more and more, more and more fire coming out of her hair, I'm presuming, right? Until she is this fully recognized demon and this fully recognized vampiric being who will come in the night and eat your dead and destroy your pregnancy and disrupt the health and happiness of your family. And I don't think it's a small thing. I'm not just telling you this because it's one fantastic, right? I mean, these are extraordinary stories and understandings and engagement that we're seeing today with her, right? With these huge carvings. The carving in the middle here is probably 2 stories tall that we see in the monkey forest that we work with in Ubud, Bali. But because I want you to be thinking about this as an anthropologist, I want you to think about this as taking these understandings of what women should and should not be doing, right? And classifying that as problematic or not, and demonizing it and building it into a story and a framework that teaches others to follow the rules. This is what happens if you step outside of these lines, right? So really interesting. And again, this one example I'm going into here too, but there's so many rich examples cross-culturally to discuss. Okay, so I'm going to move on and talk a bit about vampires and disease, right? So as a biological anthropologist, I'm very interested in that disease process. I'm very interested in the biological underpinnings of cultural behavior, right? And how that might influence cultural behavior. And here I'm going to focus predominantly on rabies and then on tuberculosis. So one of the things I find really interesting is that stories of vampires spread across Europe, and they pace with written accounts of physicians or medical people, nurses and medicinal people who are writing about what is the not diagnosing, but the symptoms of rabies. Now, they don't know what rabies is, right? But they can talk about the symptoms of rabies. They can discuss like all the challenges that are coming with rabies without them knowing exactly what is causing this, right? So we see tracking across Europe as rabies is spreading, right? So are stories about vampires. So are stories about these undead, right? And some of this is like adding on to stories that are already there, right? But what we're seeing is this tracking that goes on between the disease and this explanation of the disease. And this is particularly interesting because we see some of these stories showing up with migrations from Slavic Europe to North America. I have a skull cup. I don't know if you can see skull cup, right? And then of course you may have noticed already, but Rhonda is here joining me in my office. Okay, so I have this image on the right, a little raccoon, someone's holding their hand out, offering him treats, and it says, "Oh my, for me? And all I got you was rabies," right? Because what we know is that rabies is a zoonotic transmitted disease. So, so thinking about like how COVID, we talk about it from coming from these animal reservoirs. So whether we be bats, for instance, is one that we frequently talk about, but that any zoonotic virus or any zoonotic disease is a disease that's spread from non-human animals to humans. And so rabies is one of those. So you're going to get it from some kind of animal. Okay, so what does rabies have to do with vampires? Well, check out the symptoms of rabies. I find this so interesting. So symptoms of rabies include, and as I go through these, I want you to be thinking about how this applies to our understanding of vampires and how we think about vampires. So hydrophobic. So hydrophobic is being fearful or trying to get away from water. So for instance, if you flick water on someone, so like holy water, right? If you flick it, it feels to someone with rabies towards the end of their lives as their nerves are on fire and burning. So anything that touches them feels like fire. So what are you going to do if you're flicked with something and you are, and it feels like fire? You're going to move away, right? So avoiding bright lights and strong smells, right? Again, this is all about the nerve processing associated with rabies. And so when you have rabies, lights are so bright. It's like being in a ring light all the time, right? So you got these bright lights, smells are just super intense and super strong, and you're going to move away from them because they make you feel ill. So you think about this, it's like bright lights, so sunlight, the aversion to sunlight, strong smells, like garlic, right? insomnia. Rabies changes your sleeping schedule. So this is why they say if you see a animal walking around during daytime that's usually up only at night, be aware of it and report it because it might be rabid. So same thing happens with humans when they get it. It changes their sleeping schedule so that they're awake during the night. And so we can think about our vampire traditions of being in coffins and, getting away from the sun, getting those special like blackout curtains for your bedroom, right? And then biting. Biting is one of the things we see with people who are in their end stages of rabies. Again, touching anything or anyone hurts. So if you're trying to push someone away with your hands, it's going to hurt. If you're kicking someone, it's going to hurt. So you see is people lashing out with their teeth and trying to bite to get people away from them because it's so painful, right? I'd like to remind you that rabies is alive and well, and that it is still a problem across the globe. And so this is not just, oh, look at, 1700s Slavic Europe. This is absolutely here and now. And rabies will kill you if you do not get your boosters immediately and address it immediately to ensure that you do not actually pick up the disease. Okay, so moving on here. Let me see where we're at now. Let's build on our understanding of disease and vampires. And I said before, we're going to talk a little bit about tuberculosis, and we're going to get there with this next example. So I'll talk to you about the New England vampire panic. If you're not familiar with the New England vampire panic, I'm going to share with you one of many stories that there are out of the New England vampire panic. There's a lot of different experiences and stories. It's not just this one case, but this is a space we can talk about and explore this one particular story to really sort of see how people are reacting. And so we are going to go ahead and travel together to Exeter, Rhode Island. So this is taking place, so we're kind of like moving, I don't say moving through time, because we talk about Rangda is still a very active being within Indonesia, but certainly from talking about rabies spreading across Europe to now, then what about the 1800s is what we're looking at here. So in Exeter, Rhode Island, this is a city, let me do a framework for you here. This is a city that's in economic and demographic transition, right? This city is struggling, and that's an understatement of the year, right? This is following the Civil War, and during the Civil War, they lost over half of their population. And I want you to think about this, because who is killed, who is going to go fight in the Civil War, right? So it's men who are, let's say 12 and up, right? Just pulling a number there, and up to a certain age. So which means that the people who were killed, it's like the majority of them were men. The majority of them were men, and the men who were like within like the, if you will, the prime of their lives. And I bring this up specifically because you can think about, as a woman, the choices that you can make or not make during this time. It's not like you could, have your own credit or your own access to money, these kinds of things, right? So just thinking about how much this transitions people's lives and experiences, and especially women, but so many more. So we have half of this city has been killed during the Civil War, whether through fighting or disease. And because of the Civil War, this railroad has been put in and put through this city. So, I mean, this is great if you've got money, because you can get on the train and get out of there. Also, it means that you have a train so you can get out and explore different parts of the world. So if you aren't, if you don't have enough money, if you have no income, where you are and you're in an impoverished situation, you can leave. which means that over time, all the money and resources leave the city. And with this, we start seeing that a lot of like specialists, like doctors, for instance. So I'm painting this vision for you because we're going to talk about one particular family there and their experience in terms of vampire panic, and with this this changing landscape in which they live in. And this is important because, again, we're thinking about that cultural framework in which things occur. What we're going to talk about in terms of their experience with vampires, like we can ask, would this have occurred if this town was thriving? Would this have occurred if it was people were doing well and if they hadn't have just gone through this major national trauma? Okay, so with all of these things in terms of being impoverished and having challenges getting resources and including food, medicine, medical treatment, resources in general, these are ideal conditions for tuberculosis. And so we are going to be talking, I'll talk more about like what tuberculosis is towards the end of this section here. But it's something to keep in mind. Another term for tuberculosis is consumption. And so if you are someone who loves a costume drama of any kind, and there's someone who is, everything's going great, everyone's in love, and then someone coughs into a handkerchief and pulls away and looks at their handkerchief, and what's it covered in? Blood, speckles of blood, right? They've got consumption. They're going to be dead by the end of the movie. Sorry, spoiler alert to every single movie where someone gets consumption. Okay, so we've got consumption, and consumption is spreading rampantly through this region. So we're going to talk specifically about the Brown family here. The Brown family had a really rough go of it. And we talk about them specifically because they're very well documented, and we're going to talk about why in just a moment here. So the Brown family, their sister and mother die of a wasting disease, right? So we have some sort of a wasting disease that takes them over a long period of time. And it's really sad. It's really heart, rendering and all that. But it's, they pass. And there's the father husband is distraught. He's beside himself. He's got his daughter, Mercy, who we're going to talk about in just a moment here, and his son, who are also not looking so good. So the sister falls sick in the following years. So mom and the first sister have been passed for quite a while at this point, right? But then the sister starts having the same symptoms that the first sister and mother had. So she starts falling sick and starts wasting away. The MD is called in, right, at great expense, and the MD says, well, she has consumption, right? But what you have to remember is that they can say that it's consumption. They can say that it's, oh, yes, you have consumption and here's what we can expect. But they didn't understand what consumption was, right? They don't know. We don't have a germ theory here that we're working from that's, useful or meaningful. And so what you're being told is like, yes, there's this disease, but we don't understand it. And all we know is the pattern of it. And with a diagnosis and no origin, it becomes really challenging. Now, we can look at our own situation here with COVID, right? And how much we want answers in terms of where does this come from? How does it originate? What is this? How does it spread? How do you protect yourself, right? So think about that and think about how much incredible information we have and what incredible healthcare professionals we have to work with, right? And the information we have, and we still get that internal panic associated with it. So you can hopefully not too well, but hopefully like maybe put yourself in their shoes and understanding where they may be coming from. Okay. So with tuberculosis, again, tuberculosis is running rampant. There is no cure. There is no solution to this. We just know that it is a disease. It's going to waste you away over time. Here's one description of tuberculosis from this time period. The emancipated figure strikes one with terror, the forehead covered with drops of sweat, the cheeks painted with livid crimson, the eyes sunk, the breath offensive, quick and laborious, and the cough so incessant as to scarce allow the wretched sufferer time to tell his complaints. This is a miserable, miserable disease, and it takes a long time to process. It also is a disease that you can contract and have for many years and not show the symptoms of until they emerge, which is likely what happened. Mercy, who was just fallen ill in our story, she likely got TB from her sister or mother when caring for them, and just her body sort of held on to it into now. Okay, so I told you before that there's a brother. So this brother is, all the accounts of him are this, like, he's this like tall, broad-shouldered, kind of a hunky guy, right? The kind of guy that, you know, you wouldn't mind your daughter marrying, and that daughters wouldn't mind marrying, right? A really good-looking man, a learned man, and he had left a few years before because he was, you know, he was starting to feel a little ill, and so he went to Colorado Springs to be able to take in the air and to be able to revitalize himself. And so you may know Colorado Springs is very high altitude. It's very low humidity. It is, there's multiple places around, you know, Boulder, Colorado Springs, those where people would go to try and treat their tuberculosis symptoms and their consumption symptoms. All right, so we have this real, like, sexy, like, smart, interesting man about town who comes in. So do you have him in your head? Okay, so we're going to use, we have our friend the Duke here as our working example. So the brother comes into town to be able to, like, be there for his sister and take care of his sister. But the sister dies. The sister dies. So this is Mercy, and she dies. And now people are starting to panic. The family is starting to panic. The neighbors are starting to panic, right? And what we see is that the brother, remember, the brother was a little ill before he came back. His symptoms started coming back right as Mercy dies, and he starts wasting away. And we all know that when really good looking, you know, smart men about town start wasting away, that's when we start getting really worried, right? That's when we're really, really upset. So the neighborhood starts getting really concerned and starts rallying for some kind of answer, some kind of, some sort of outcome. Like, how are we going to address this? What are we going to do? And they come up with a solution that I'm assuming that we would all come up with, which is we're going to go ahead and exhume all the bodies to find out who it is that's raising from the dead to feed on this kind young gentleman. So they make this decision. Again, the neighbors are making this decision. This is what we're going to do. The father is like, absolutely not. This doesn't make any sense. The doctor is like, this doesn't make any sense. And they still go do it, right? There comes a point where you don't get to say no anymore, right? So they go out and they exhume the bodies. They exhume first the mother, who had died first, and then the second sister. Again, the idea being that they had died from the same disease, so they are now embodied with this. There are these vampires who are raising up and feeding off of the living and causing others to have this disease as well, right? Or not to have this disease, but have this wasting away and having their blood sucked from them every night, right? And they first pull up mom and sister and their bones. There's nothing much left of them, right? They've broken down over time. But then they exhume Mercy, our most recent sister who dies. The Providence Journal, which is one of the reasons that we know so many details about this story. So the Providence Journal is there covering this because at this point, there's multiple vampire panic stories happening. And so they're starting to cover these and starting to talk about what's going on. And so there's a journalist there at this exhumation. They write that the body, this is Mercy's body, the most recent sister who died. The body was in fairly well-preserved state. The heart and liver were removed. And in cutting open the heart, clotted and decomposed blood was found. So they found this clotted and decomposed blood in the heart. And this is actually what they were looking for. They were seeing, does she have any signs of being raising from the dead? And they wanted to see if she has blood in her heart, because that would indicate that she's been up and feeding on the living. So in addition to finding this clotted blood in her heart, that to them indicated that she was the vampire. She was the one who was rising up and feeding off the living. They also noticed that her nails seemed to have grown and that her hair had also grown. Oof, a little creepy, right? Or a lot creepy. So they're recognizing her nails are still growing, her hair is still growing, and that her heart is filled with blood. Now, there's also a doctor at the site, and he does a sort of rapid graveside autopsy. And he finds that her lungs showed diffuse tuberculosis germs, is the way that he put it, right? So that he was like, this is tuberculosis, this is consumption, this is what she has, you know, this is what she died of, right? We've got this. So the neighbors mill around, right? And they're trying to decide what to do, because you've got, on one hand, her heart's filled with clotted blood. On the other hand, you have this science-based information about her disease process. And so I'm sure you can all imagine what the decision-making was. So they decide, okay, they've dug her up. They're going to go ahead and take her heart and her liver, and they're going to burn it into ashes and put it into a powder and make it into a tonic. Now, they don't actually have images from that time period of what the tonic looked like, but here's a lovely tonic water for you to think about, and her liver and heart every time you have a tonic water or a gin and tonic. You're welcome. So the heart and liver were burnt. Mercy's heart and liver were burnt, and the ashes were fed to her brother. And buckle up, friends, because you will be shocked to hear that the brother dies, even after having drunk his sister's clotted blood, heart, and liver. Now, this is a tragic family story, but it's also a tragic story of a city. It's a tragic story of what happens economically when when resources are removed or lessened, right? We can start seeing these pieces, but why do we know about this? Why do we know so much about Mercy's story? Well, I told you already that the newspaper staff was there, and that they were taking really copious notes. But these newspapers, she drew in an anthropologist, and it was written about as a journal article in the American Anthropologist, which is the premier journal for anthropologists. And it pulls on Mercy's story and the Brown's family story, as well as these other pieces of vampire panic that I see. But this one was a space where the anthropologists specifically came and did interviews and tried to understand what was going on, and why this was happening. Why it was happening there as opposed to happening, for instance, 50 miles down the road, where vampire panics were not an issue. You may be able to guess that is also a place that was well resourced, and is also a place where people had access to care and services and food. It is also a place where less people were pulled on to perform military service. So there's some thought that Bram Stoker also utilized this story. So Dracula came out a little more than a year after Mercy Brown's story was published both in the newspaper and in American Anthropologist. And there is thematic evidence. So Bram Stoker did a great job with Dracula. He pulled together these different cultural traditions and really tried to understand and capitalize to be able to like frame his vampire as really sort of culturally sound, if you will. And there's a character in the book, I believe her name is Lucy, which I think is a combination of Mercy Luna, which is the woman we were just speaking of, her name, and her story as being this young, like 19-year-old who is wasting away and being fed on by vampires and becomes a vampire herself. And many of the themes are the same, where they have to go out to her graveside. There's a physician graveside. They have to remove her heart, which is filled with clotted blood. So again, this is a story of a family tragedy. This is a story of a city's tragedy and a region's and a nation's tragedy, right? But it's one that permeates through and really frames how we understand vampires to this day. Okay, so if we step back, I'm giving you these couple of like more in-depth examples. I do just want to share that there's these different ways that we see response to vampire panics, right? Both the New England vampire panic and other vampire panics around the world. So this bottom left-hand corner is a Croatian vampire. And this is someone who is they were unearthed, that they were disinterred, and after they had been dead for a while, someone had jammed this piece of stone in their mouth. So we can tell that based off of the skull, what's happened to them before they died or recently after death, and what's happened significantly after their death, right? So again, there's many stories and many examples of this. But here are the most common responses to vampires. Eating ashes, whether it's eating the ashes of a heart, a liver, combined other parts of the bodies get involved in it, but certainly consuming ashes in some way or making them into tonics to drink, to be giving specifically to the people that are thought to being fed off of, is one, a really good way to give someone else tuberculosis, but also a really common theme that we see. We also see flipping bodies. So you disinter somebody, you get in, you're staring at this dead body, and you just like flip them over. The idea being that they'll be so confused in their grave that they'll just dig down. When they're ready to come out and feed, they'll just dig down into the earth instead of come up and feed on the living. We see reburying bodies, modifying the organization of their bones. So the Jolly Roger, which is the center here, right? So you might think of like as a pirate flag, right? The pirate emblem. The Jolly Roger is thought by some to originate from vampire practices to ward off vampires. These are both leg bones. And so your leg bones, you might not know much about anatomy, but you know that your leg bones don't live up here unless you're a contortionist, right? And so what we see is bodies that are disinterred and post-mortem, that their bodies are rearranged and the bones are rearranged. And this is a fairly common pattern of rearrangement. We see as these rearrangement of the leg bones under the head. Again, the idea is that the vampire would not be able to reassemble their bodies and basically just give up. And we've all had those days, right? Where it's just like, there's just too many things you have to do to get out the door. And you're just like, okay, I just can't today. And imagine if your leg bones were around your neck and you had to reassemble your whole body before you went and fed off the living. The other thing that we see is burning bodies, right? And so again, this is evidence. We have this evidence. We can use archaeological evidence for this. Our understandings of forensics feeds into this and understanding what bodies do and don't do post-mortem. And again, what bodies look like if you're modifying them while they're living, if you're modifying them soon after death, and then a time period after death. So burning bodies is another frequent piece. And again, sometimes it's just, like we've talked about, like burning hearts, but we also be burning the entire body long-term post-mortem. Okay. So let's return back to that really, really, really creepy fact about the nails still growing, right? And the hair still growing, which I know the story, I know the reason. I'm obviously here sharing it with you, but I'm still getting goosebumps, just thinking about it, right? And what we're seeing is that this is a misinterpretation of decomposition and disease. We are seeing, information that we have more people have information about now in terms of the processes of what just naturally happens as people are interred. What happens as your body breaks down? Well, it might not surprise you to find out that Mercy had only been dead for 2 months when they dug her up. And furthermore, she died in the midst of winter. So the ground was cold. Not to mention the fact that the grave was probably a little bit more shallow than it would have been, because if you're out there, and anyone from the Northeast knows that it gets real, real cold in the middle of winter, and the ground is real, real hard. So she likely was closer to the surface, which means colder temperatures. And it means that her body would not have decomposed as much. And certainly it wouldn't have decomposed as much as her mother and sister who died years and years and years before, right? So the clotted blood in her heart is just part of the process of her heart breaking down, but also still being somewhat preserved because of the cold. The skin receding from her nails. If you look at your nails, take a moment, look at those nails, right? That's that little soft cuticle, right? That's right at your nail bed. That's been your thinnest tissue you have on your whole body, right? This tissue is going to be really, really thin, just like your gum tissue is going to be thin. Your vaginal and rectal tissue is going to be thin, right? It's this is the skin around your eyelids, right? Your skin in your nostrils, right? This is going to be your thinnest tissue, and it's going to be the first tissue to break down, right? So with this, what we see is that the skin recedes back, because it's the skin that's breaking down, and it's sort of pulling back and shriveling up, if you will. Also, if you look at those tactile pads, your fingertips there, that little fatty tissue, that's going to break down. And so what it's going to look like is that, because that's reducing both on the top and bottom of your finger, it's going to make it look like your nails are growing even after you're dead. Same thing with the hair, right? Your scalp is a very thin tissue, and that's one of your first tissues to break down in the decomposition process. So it's this also, I'm going to skip to blood from the mouth, same thing. In many of the vampire stories and many of the vampire panic stories, we read that someone is disinterred and their mouth is covered in blood, their teeth are covered in blood, they've got blood coming down the sides of their mouths. I'm sure you can think of many illustrations in pop culture that have this kind of imagery associated, right? And this again is part of that very thin tissue breaking down, releasing blood, releasing the tissue and coating the mouth, and having it read as, we don't know what goes on with dead bodies. This must be unusual. Let's remember that this is a time where we're digging up, like we don't have cadavers for medical schools, right? And people are being paid to disinter people to use them. So it's knowing what's going on with dead people is not everybody, like everybody doesn't know what that is and what that looks like. And I wanted to say the bloated corpses here, because you'll also see stories about how they disinter someone and they've been feeding because they're all bloated up from consuming so much and eating so much. Like this person looks like they've stuffed themselves silly with a meal. And as some of you might be able to figure out and guess, that is associated with gas. And the gas is part of the normal breakdown of bodies. And that gas being building up inside and bloating bodies out, making them look like they are full, making them look like they've had a meal. Okay, so again, thinking all these pieces of the puzzle and understanding these normal changes in terms of bodies and decomposition, and how we try to understand the things that we don't. Okay, so coming back to tuberculosis, and because especially with Mercy's family, consumption tuberculosis was the key component in what ended up, really destroying them. Tuberculosis is, I want to ensure that, you walk away with a knowledge base on this, right? It's a bacterial respiratory infection, which means it can be treated with antibiotics. But what we are seeing is multiple strains of antibacterial resistance strains. And so really, really challenging disease to battle. And certainly not enough resources to battle them in the spaces that we need to be. This is associated with, that I kind of got this from this quote, but just so you recognize it, this high fever, hacking, bloody cough, and this visible wasting away of the body. It's a slow and painful death. And you can survive tuberculosis, but also your body can hold on to tuberculosis and it can re-emerge later on in your life. So this is one quote about tuberculosis I think helps kind of, again, frame this as this understanding of it as this biological component, but also you can start understanding how people can misunderstand this as vampirism. So the disease progressed in such a way that it seemed like something was draining the life and blood out of somebody. Right? It's a very confusing disease, and the struggle of not being able to take care of someone you love when they're struggling in these ways is just overwhelming. I've included these images below, which are haunting and just terrible, because I want us to be reminded that tuberculosis is a contemporary disease, that people are dying from tuberculosis and people are actively getting tuberculosis. In 2020, over 10 million people were infected with tuberculosis. And it's really hard to get your brain around 10 million people and what that looks like. But that's pretty much all of the people in adults, children, all the people in North Carolina. And we have just over 10 million people who reside in our state. So it's sobering and something to keep in mind. And it's where, as we're thinking about this, we're thinking about disease, we're thinking about our interactions with disease. Okay, so bringing it all home and bringing it all together, and I'm really looking forward to your questions. And as you're thinking about questions, please, if you haven't been already, throw them in the chat. We'd love to be able to answer some of those for you and help you explore some of those themes. Some of the takeaway conclusions from this, right? Again, coming back from this like anthropological, epidemiological, historical, economic, and forensic framework that we're using here. We know that cultures use morality stories to maintain behavior. So this comes back to Rangda. This comes back to, controlling people's behavior, especially with vampires, controlling women's behaviors through these fears and frights. And this can happen to you. And if you aren't doing this, you can become this woman who is disrupting pregnancies. We see that cultures around the globe create meaning from fear, right? When we don't know something, when we are working from a lack of information, when we don't when that information doesn't fit with our understanding of the world, right, which is equally as important, right, we come up with answers that are motivated by that fear. We come up with explanations that are motivated and ways of coping that are motivated with that. And we've talked through some biological explanation to explain vampires. So we've talked about rabies, we talked about tuberculosis, and we talked about these natural decomposition processes that we understand. Okay, so with this one, thank you for being here, and thank you for listening and participating. And I know that there are so many more stories we could talk about and ways to explore vampires and vampire traditions. And I would love to hear any questions that you might have. Oh, and before I do that, maybe pop this over here. If you are interested in getting in contact with me, there's my email address, howellsm@uncw.edu. And then also, if you are a vintage computer user and use Facebook still, please join us at the UNCW Department of Anthropology page. I am one of the admins, and so these kinds of stories do not infrequently pop up on the page. I run the GAPS lab on campus, which is the Growth, Adaptation, Pregnancy, Stress Lab. And so if you're interested in knowing what I'm doing when I am not giving presentations while wearing horns, surrounded by demons, and discussing vampires, that would be a place to check out. And then Bali, we talked about Ramda. If you're interested in learning more, join us at the Balinese Macaque Ethnoprimatology Field School page on Facebook. So this is a space when we're not in the middle of a global pandemic. We take students and team members to Bali, Indonesia, and we work within a 3,000-year-old Hindu temple that has over 1,000 monkeys in it, has in typical times over 1,000 tourists, and is actively used by the Hindu worshippers. So it is as chaotic and magnificent as it sounds. But regardless of where you are in terms of your learning path, your learning lives, consider checking out the page, because there's some incredible images on there, and I think you might find it particularly interesting. So with that, I would love to answer any questions that anyone has.
We do have a few questions, Michaela.
Great.
First one is from Michaela Kelly.
All right.
She says, what do you think explains the recent vampire glamorization and popularization in society in the past decade? It seems to have surpassed being a trend and a fantasy genre.
Ooh, so I can take some, I can give you some broad sweeping components. So it's certainly beyond the last decade. I mean, this is built up over generations, and we certainly see it before Bram Stoker, right? Vampires are already a very hot topic, but we see it even emerge more and more. I'm going to actually stop screen sharing so I can see you all. I can share that again by the end of the discussion if anyone needs to catch it still. But there's certain themes that we see emerge with Bram Stoker's Dracula. We end up seeing focus on men and becoming a real power transition, right, in terms of this very sort of sexualized version of vampires, and the idea that these vampires are sort of preying on the weak, or being able to prey on them, and it's all a parallel story to sexuality. And they talk about the penetration of teeth is indicating a penetration of something else, right? And there's a fascination with that. There's a fascination with the power play. There's fascination with sexuality. There's a fascination with the unknown. There's a fascination with the idea of sort of tangoing with death and trying to find yourself in these different spaces that are outside of the norm of society, that are outside of what you're told is appropriate or not, right? And there's a major draw to that, and it kicks up that we have different themes of different vampires. Like every generation has their own set of vampires that are these, especially more recently, these very sexualized beings, and it is just I think it's just fascinating. And I'm really interested to see what the next set of vampires are.
Next question from Catherine Flynn. Bram Stoker's Dracula. Dracula described as hairy palms. Do you think this has any connection to the urban legend about males growing hair on their palms as they self-pleasure?
Oh my God, that's so excellent. I don't know that, but I love that as an idea. Excellent. This is why I like doing these kind of talks, because there's so much knowledge that y'all have. And I don't know, but now I want to know. If anyone finds it out, email me immediately.
I just remember one, and I have to. I'm never going to take these fangs off, but I have to. How far back? Right, I was just thinking about this when you were talking earlier. A lot of this mythology seems to come from like the 1700s, 1800s, somewhere there.
Yeah.
But doesn't it go back in sort of a vampiric way for other creatures and things way back further than that?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's so much crossover, right? There's so much crossover in terms of, you know, the idea of like what a vampire looks like when we're thinking of it. You know, this culturally constructed version that we really lean heavily into in these themes. I mean, there's certain things that are very specific when you ask someone what a vampire is, right? But we can absolutely look back in time, and, you know, we're seeing like in Mesopotamia, we're seeing carvings into the wall of these vampiric beings, Lamasta, right? It is definitely has this very, very, very deep background. We're afraid of the unknown, and we give the unknown shapes that are similar to humans and beasts to be able to help describe the unknown and trying to answer questions. And we're nothing if real creative at coming up with nightmares for ourselves.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Okay, another question from Carrie Stein. Is there an intersection between the belief of incorrupt bodies as saints, typically seen in the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Church, and more or less decomposed bodies of suspected vampires?
Another amazing question. So there's been some writings on that are indicating like in tying that together. And I mean, a lot of what we see in terms of vampire, you know, vampire, I want to say morphology, that's not quite, but stories have a lot of themes within the Catholic Church and tie within the Catholic Church. And so it would make sense in terms of the incorruptible body and the one in the grave. Good connections.
Okay, and one more from the Q&A. Is there any biological explanation for the prolonged life after death that vampires are supposed to have?
Prolonged life after death. So I think that ties really well into the bleeding gums, ties really well into the nails growing like after they're pulled up. And that is what I would lean into for that. But you know, I can't think of any other like examples immediately that would tie in like another biological reason for like the life after death.
I got one more thought, by the way. You're talking about the zoonotic diseases and the rabies and things like that. Is that because when I think of vampires in a modern sort of mythic thing, I think of werewolves as well.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Related, those two things?
I think it comes back to this idea that there's like all these sort of things that go bump in the night, right? And that crossover where we're trying to like break out like werewolves and, you know, vampires and demons and witches, right? It's kind of all has the same spoke to it, right? With just different versions of it and different ways that we interact with it. But yeah, I mean, werewolves are right in there. And for anyone who's like gone through the Twilight saga, you can tell that absolutely there's a relationship between vampires and werewolves, and that there's absolutely a ongoing lifelong battle. And I don't mean to brag. So I'm myself not a Twilight fan. It came out after I was just a little bit older when it came out, and so that wasn't a good fit to me. But I don't mean to brag. But my parents used to force us to go spend the 4th of July in Forks, Washington, which is where Twilight is set. And the reason it's set there is because it's the darkest place. It has the lowest UV radiation of anywhere in the United States. And so my parents, who are British, who love a dreary weather more than anything, would take us there. And every 4th of July, it would rain. And we'd be standing out watching a parade with umbrellas, being just like super over it, right? And then Twilight comes out when we're adults and we're like, oh my gosh, everyone wants to go to Forks, Washington now. People go there for vacations, which I mean, go for it, pilgrimage there. There's really great seafood. But yeah, it was that's like my one claim to fame. My one claim to fame is that I've been to Forks, Washington, which is where all the Twilight series takes place. So you're welcome.
Very good. I thought that was a documentary. What's I guess the sort of the last one my thought was, because we had a couple of people you asked at the start, right? Name some. Brad Pitt, An Interview with the Vampire was one. Some people on Buffy the Vampire Slayer, a couple of other ones people mentioned. What's your favorite? What is your favorite myth? Or
well,
reality, if you think
okay, well, I love Rhonda. Like I adore Rhonda, and I'm not saying that as a cheesy anthological answer, but oh my God, I love Rhonda so much. I mean, who doesn't love this like empowered widow lady with this like body that is seen as not perfection, right? Because she's got these long pendulous breasts, and she's like this embodiment of being just like a woman who's in her own, right? And then she's like, come on, let's all hang out, witches. Let's all hang out and really upset everyone around us. So that's my overall answer now. I got to tell you, though, that I'm a child of the 80s. So the Lost Boys.
Lost Boys.
Oh, gosh, yes.
Okay. And we were actually carving pumpkins last night and listening to the soundtrack, and like the saxophone song in the middle. Anyways, so love that. And then so fantastic. And then also Interview with the Vampire is just tremendous. And I'm already like a real like overly dramatic, dressy uppy type person. And so Interview with the Vampire coming out when I was like 13 or 14 years old was like perfection.
Right.
Perfection.
Yeah, I got to put in for Gary Oldman as Dracula and Bram Stoker's Dracula. Come on.
I can fully support that. Yeah,
Yes.
I can fully support that. He's all kinds of fabulous. I'm going to put on my glasses so I can actually see some of the comments when we have the chat.
Gary Oldman had a lot of fun with that. I was like Christopher Lee in those old Hammer horror things as well. He was
My dad's favorite. My dad's favorite there.
statuesque, but the older.
So as we're I'll be here for a couple more minutes. If people have questions, throw them in. I do want to point out that I do teach amazing classes. And so if you are a student at UNCW or interested being one of our lifelong learners, come take my classes. I would love to have you in there. And this is actually from one of the, it's from one of the lectures that I do give in class, but that's Vampires, Zombies, and the Plague. So it's actually over a couple of days that we explore these topics and build into it and talk about all these different ways that we understand these again, creepy crawlies, bumps in the nights, and understand it through this biological and cultural framework, right? So, whether you're a lifelong learner, come join me. If you are at UNCW or thinking about UNCW, come join me. I have a lab where I have active students doing all kinds of great research, and we ask all sorts of kind of amazing questions. So do consider reaching out and talking to me here. I'll put up that. Oh, actually, let me just put it in the chat here. Put my email in here. Again, feel free to reach out with any questions or chats.
Carolyn, was there any more? Did I see another one pop up, or am I making that?
Oh yeah, let me see. Beth Sarah Swanson says, I noticed there are quite a bit of intersection between the constructions of vampires, demons, and witches in your discussion of the monstrous feminine. Why do you think this was the case in early descriptions of vampires, whereas these monsters are often more clearly delineated in contemporary iterations of horror?
Will you read that to me one more time?
Okay. I noticed that there is quite a bit of intersection between the constructions of vampires, demons, and witches in your discussion of the monstrous feminine. Okay. Why do you think this was the case in earlier descriptions of vampires, whereas these monsters are often more clearly delineated in contemporary iterations of horror?
Okay, so I think what they're asking there is like, okay, so why they framed more towards the feminine in these earlier versions, if you will, and then later on it's these more masculinized bodies. there's a lot of different things I can say about this, and I want to say about this. There's a lot of writing on this, which I adore that people dug into, right? But certainly the idea of the power play and the morality play of trying to make sure and keeping, especially women in line, women and non-binary individuals in line, and making sure that they are following what is expected, right? And responding to the patriarchy, because it requires that power requires to be maintained and like for all members of society, for it to be kept in place, right? If you have this huge uprising of non-males, for instance, you're not going to keep your power. And so having these stories and these frameworks to be able to control women and to ensure that people are continuing doing what they're supposed to be doing and following through is going to be, it is really important as contemporarily, but was extraordinarily important, right? It helps keep people where they're supposed to be. And we certainly have these stories for all other groups as well, but we see it over and over in terms of control of women. There's this transition that occurs, and I think this is what you're maybe identifying, where it's this idea of these like male bodies that become, you know, it's like we have your Draculas, Frankenstein's monster, you know, the Wolf Man, right? These male bodies, and it's certainly male demons aren't new, right? But also, if you think about, like in the Bible, we talk about the devil. The devil is beautiful. The devil is like supposed to be like the most beautiful angel, right? And so you even lean into these ideas of you know, beauty, and if you think of beauty as you know, femininity, right? These frameworks. If you look at many of our vampires that we lean into today, they tend to be more feminized males in some ways, right? So we still have some of those themes there. But part of it is who is writing the books, who is writing the stories. You know, Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, right? So we have a female author in there. But, you know, especially with like Dracula hitting, it becomes this, it becomes an additional sensation of this is who you're putting as this masculinized body. And he's not the first, he's not the only by any means, but it becomes, it's a very widely read book, and one that helps shape how we contemporarily talk about it, and who we want to see, who we want to read about, who we want to see on a screen, right? At least who men want to see on a screen, and who they want to read about, right? Are these males who are in control, the males who are overpowering others. And so there's all these levels that tie together with it.
One more, we have another one. Why do you think vampires as cinematic iconic are more influential, or seem to be, than other monsters?
Oh. I don't know. Let me start there. But here's what I think. I think it's because they're so tightly tied into sexuality, and they're so tightly tied into stepping outside of cultural norms, and especially around sexuality. And we are drawn to the taboo. We are interested in stigmatized information and stigmatized behavior. We're pulled in, and especially, you know, we have a very puritanical stance sexually, right, within the United States. I mean, obviously there's pockets and parts and communities that aren't so much, but if you think about, for instance, somebody to teach sex ed within a classroom, try to put menstrual products in a men's bathroom, because there are men who have periods as well, right? Trying to do any of those things, it becomes there's a huge backlash against it, right? And these are just some very low-hanging fruit to talk about in terms of how we interact with sexuality and discussing it or not discussing it. So with it, it becomes this extraordinary taboo topic that becomes really exciting to engage with. And so there's no surprise to me that especially young people really tie into these vampire stories, right? Of these like these very sort of hypersexualized beings. And a lot of times these beings are very, can be really androgynous. These beings can be, you know, there's very feminized males, there's non-binary individuals, there's a space and flexibility that we, is not something that we've seen until more recently on the screen, using that example, right? And it gives a way of exploring these spaces and these identities that we don't have otherwise, but also plays into that demonization of those identities and those relationships. There's just so much here. I need someone to go ahead and teach a class on this whole thing so I can take it and learn more, and so we can explore all of this.
This one that just came up in the chat, which I think is related to that too, because that makes a lot of what you just said makes great sense.
Mm-hmm.
You think the powers like mind control, extreme strength rather, comes from the same place, I guess, sort of a superhero kind of thing, but a dark, pointy-toothed one.
Mm-hmm. So do we think that like mind control and powers like mind control and extreme strength come from the same place, like in terms of the control, in terms of sexuality? I think there's a lot of crossover in there. I don't know when we see like mind control come in as a vampiric trait, right? I can't say like, okay, well, it's 1428 when we see the first drug. That's not my jam, but it's been that we see more and more increasingly, right? The pieces, and it ties really well into that understanding of, again, that taboo sexuality of it all. But also there's a lot of space to explore there in terms of abuse, right? And abusive relationships. We can talk about how when writing the Twilight books, the author, like in interviews, she talks about when she's framing the sexuality component of it, and especially the first time that the main characters have sex, it's a very violent, painful experience, and it's coded as, coached as like, well, that's what it is. Like there's no opportunity for it not to be that, because if you're having sex with a vampire, this is what it is going to be like, right? So framing, and she actively made choices to make sex violent and frightening and distressing. And she writes about how it's trying to deter young women. She's a devout Mormon, at least was at the time of writing. I'm not really up on her now, but like devout Mormon, and she wanted to sort of help young women reading these books to not engage in sex. Same thing comes when she wrote about pregnancy and delivery, that it was a painful experience that will kill you, right? So there's a theme in Twilight of the pregnancy is deadly if you're being, as a human, if you're being impregnated by a vampire, right? And so I bring this up because I know, like, Gareth, this is not your vampire of choosing, but millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of people read this book, and the number of people who like came of age reading these books is tremendous and powerful. And again, these are not the stories that I'm drawn to, but they're really important stories to a lot of individuals, and not just women, right? There's a lot of people who are drawn to these. And the fact that so many people, that maybe their first sex scenes that they've ever read, or sexual encounters that they've ever been able to like engage with in any sort of pop culture, are these violent scenes and these violent, painful introductions to what doesn't need to be a painful experience. Like, I think that these are very purposeful tellings of a life, and a very purposeful morality play that the writer created, right? And so, I mean, that's a more recent-ish example, right? But we also see that, again, this has echoes to what we see with Rhonda's story and Lamnia and Lamasta and all of these individuals that we're talking about. Isn't this cool?
It is.
Look at us. This is
I love it.
I'm obviously super biased because here I am shocked talking about it, but I love the questions. I love the thought processes behind them. And I think that there's so much space to be able to like ask these kinds of questions and explore why we're pulled to it, and what is this telling us, and what does it mean that we're drawn to it? And what does it mean that this is what we're, especially as young people, drawn to? Right?
Kind of makes me wonder when you're just saying that, because what you just said was really interesting in terms of the violence and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
If this will evolve, if the mythology will evolve further on, you know, because it's always been violent, right? And sexualized and things like that.
Yeah.
Where does it, will it stay the same or similar or go or change? I mean, how much will it change? I don't know. It just makes me wonder what happens with the mythology over time as it evolves.
Well, buckle up, right? Because that's what anthropology is always trying to do, is like, what are we doing? Where are we going? And thinking about it as this starting point of women who aren't following the rules, and they're going to come and if they're going to eat your babies, and they're going to lead you to have a miscarriage, and they're a risk factor for you. And like, you don't want to be around women like that, because they might lead to your fetal demise, right? And the shifts in the narratives in terms of vampires certainly change, but there's still the narratives of like, you want to avoid those kinds of people, you want to avoid this kind of, you know, those kind of women, those kind of girls, like you don't want to be around those. And I think that the stories that are told and the vampires that are put on a screen, we see changes in terms of who are writing those characters. But I think that as we see more women writers, we see more non-binary writers, we see more writers of color, as we start exploring different types of vampire, I think that we will absolutely see these stories change and emerge. And it's see this framework shifting. I mean, it's very active. Everyone, I mean, people get behind a vampire story real fast. And there's so much space to tell so many amazing stories in a lot of different frameworks. So it'll happen. We have a lot of creative people who are in our talk right now who, you know, I know several of the people in here are creative writing specialists and creative writing majors. And this is your call to arms, you know, build on it, write on it. We want to hear what you've got to say.
I mean, do you think, I'm seeing like vampires mainly though, you talk about Ramda, but it seems like lately the focus is on male vampires a lot more than the female vampires. They're always the story, you know, True Blood is always, you know, Vampire
True
Eric.
Blood. Oh, that's what I missed. Yes. There's so many. Right. But think about male writers writing for a male audience.
Yeah.
Right. It is a powerful thing. It is the, like, no one, you know, it's the you know, boys will, like, girls will read boys' books, but boys won't read girls' books. Like that whole idiom of like, oh well, we need to ensure that we're, you know, this is the way that we get the most readers, is this having a male character, and that's somewhat shifting, right? But it's slow, and it's still, I mean, we have a lot of space to go on it, right? But as we're thinking about who's writing it and who they're writing for and what's being accepted as a character and a plot moving forward, right? It's again, as I say, like, as we have different people who are in those writing rooms and who are actually constructing you know, living, breathing characters that are non-male, I think we'll see a shift in what those look like. And I think, I mean, there's space for female characters, non-binary characters to be doing the same things that male vampires have been doing forever. And I know that they typically have to wear like vinyl pants while doing it, right? But there's a lot of space and there's a lot of stories, because these stories are timeless. These stories are exciting and engaging and dangerous, and morality plays around life and death and existence, and, you know, these transitions between these different life stages. And it's just there's a reason why there's so much crossover between, like, you know, we keep saying like demons and werewolves and, you know, all these demons and ghoulies, right? It's because these are timeless stories and the ways of us explaining ourselves and to each other, you know, and trying to frame who we are as a community and what we stand for, don't stand for. And, you know, it's we tell our story through horror. We tell our story through what we're afraid of as much as what we are not afraid of.
Mm. Somebody mentioned earlier that their favorite vampire was Queen of the Damned, which I thought was one which is actually a slightly different paradigm of a non-white woman.
Yeah, exactly. There are so many. There is so many.
That's the exception to the rule, I suspect, but yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely exceptions to the rule, but also let's have more of that, right?
Yeah.
I'd watch that.
Oh, yeah.
I'd read that.
Definitely
I'd watch
good.
that. No.
There's another, I don't know if you want to do any more. What time are we? Forget a minute. There's one or two in the chat if you want to have a look.
Sure. I'll put on my glasses so I can actually see the question.
There's two at the end there.
Okay. I just read Kendall's comment that typically her Tuesday nights suck. I'm going to go with the pun, and I appreciate the vampire pun. So they did it in a different way. I'm glad.
I already did fangs for coming in the chat. See,
excellent.
See, had to
I
do
love
it.
a pun.
I mean, there's just a lot at stake, you know? I mean, all right, bad pun, sorry.
Anyway.
Okay, you're right. Do you think there's an anthropological connection between the use of vampires and the relationships with immorality and death in literature and films? Often vampires are portrayed as young and beautiful, yet they're always struggling to stay alive and always trying to escape death. Why do you think this is so important to the myth of vampires? Oh my gosh, right? I mean, this is such a core component. They're always at like the peak of their bodies. Like no one becomes, well, Interview the Vampire, I know there are kids, you know, there's also Lost Boys, kids become vampires, but that's like, you know, a side throwaway character, but the core ones are always like super good shape, 20-year-old, like excellent.
Super hot.
Right? Yeah, they're at the pinnacle of health while being dead, right? And there is so much to go into there in terms of this like relationship with immortality and the trying to stay, you know, young forever and not, but then also the fact that young, you know, lean into this right now, that young people are trying to destroy everybody else's life. And this is, I mean, we can even look at this with the whole like, you know that we all hated that the you know, everyone was against millennials, and then it's like, you know, the Gen Z, and then all these different generations, and every generation will be the worst generation ever because they're the younger ones, they're the 20-year-olds, they're the ones with the least amount of resources, the least amount of power, the least amount of control, but we can still pin them with being the bad guys, right? Because they can't fight back. That's not your question, but at the same time, the reality and the desperation of being young and somehow between being the peak physical form and not having the full access to everything you need to be a fully successful adult is a really major challenge. I think we'll see explored more within films and that. So this idea of it's like this trade-off between life and death at all times, right? And this idea that you're barely staying alive. And it's, I think a lot of that honestly has to do with writers coming to grips with their own mortality as we're watching. There's a reason why there are a lot of different stories about writers, like slumpy male writers who end up with like hot babes by the end of a movie or a story or a book or whatever, right? And not that can't happen, right? But it's more about like how they're presenting themselves and what they want to see, right? And this idea of like, I can't stay young forever, but then I'm dying when I'm not young, you know, and which is not accurate at all. But I think that is part of it. And the young and beautiful component, that again is a more recent, like that's showing up in the last couple hundred years as being the most commonly occurring component. But then also we can start getting into the idea of like, you know, virgin dying, and then, you know, them being, you know, taken advantage of by vampires and dying, again, getting into that morality play. I didn't answer your question, but I answered a lot of really cool other questions that you didn't ask. And that's the key. That's the key to a good professor.
But they're a fantasy, right?
These are great questions. I love them. You forgot to take your lunch. Okay, Aaron, eat your lunch. You need to eat.
Is that last question? I think we're at 8 o'clock. I think.
So, okay, do you think there was an economic aspect in that there were vampire killers for hire? Well, it's got to be, right? I mean, there's a market for everything, and certainly having people who are going to be brave enough to go and kill somebody who it doesn't exist. I mean, if you can make a buck off of it, go for it. I strongly recommend. And if you can do it while wearing vinyl pants, all that much better, right?
Better.
So,
well, fangs. Wear fangs.
Yeah.
Things are good too.
Yeah. Y'all, thank you for coming out tonight. Thank you for spending your Tuesday evening with me. And again, you have my email, and I'll pop it in the chat one more time, and come take my classes if you're here in Wilmington. And otherwise, thank you, and thank you to the Bellamy Mansion.
Thanks so much for doing this. This has been
Thank
really
you.
fun and really informative and fun at the
Yes.
same time, which is grand. And
Good.
happy Halloween to everybody.
Happy
Everybody's going as
Halloween,
vampires
everybody.
now, right?
Be
Yeah.
Oh, and let
safe.
me let me push our monster movie madness on Friday
Oh, yeah.
night. Come and watch
Yeah.
2 movies for free at the Bellamy.
Yes. Yes.
And
And dress up.
Old horror. Yeah.
So dress up and go vote, everybody.
Yes.
That too. Yes. All right. Well, thanks very much, everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Okay. Is there a way, I see we're still recording.